On today's World Insight, in sickness and in health, how has the viral epidemic affected China-U.S. relations? And alarm bells over an outbreak of locusts, how big a threat to Africa and Asia? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, the program coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. Let's start with the latest on the coronavirus, also known as COVID-19. The total number of confirmed cases in China is over 74,000. The death toll stands at over 2,000, while more than 12,000 have recovered. The virus has spread to 25 other countries, which altogether have reported more than 900 cases. As the virus spreads, so too has the economic repercussions. The brewing viral epidemic means there might be an extra hurdle on the global economy and businesses. Before we get to the discussion, take a look at the latest first.
New confirmed COVID-19 cases are being reported daily around the world. The virus has been recorded in several countries in the Asia-Pacific, Europe, North America, Africa, and the Middle East. The World Health Organization has called on nations to speed up research on the COVID-19 while cautioning that travel restrictions and quarantines directed at individual countries might do more harm than good after a series of drastic measures in response to the epidemic crisis. The U.S. was the first to evacuate personnel from its consulate in Wuhan and the first to impose a travel ban on Chinese travelers. Tough policies from the U.S. government have been seen by many as a challenge to the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. Sui Tiankai, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, has warned both sides to guard against any political virus, in addition to the biological one. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently slammed the imposition of travel bans as an overreaction and urged the United States not to take unnecessary measures that could hamper trade and travel.
Given the U.S. comprehensive ban on people-to-people exchange between the two countries, practically that will bring up some challenges to the implementation of the agreement. We hope all parties can respect the WHO's professional advice not to take unnecessary trade and travel restrictions.
Fears over the coronavirus's impact on the global economy have been growing. Several large companies said their production may be hurt and the damage may spill over into various industries. On Monday, tech titan Apple warned of global supply shortages resulting from factories being shut down due to the COVID-19 outbreak. The Phase 1 trade agreement between China and the U.S. went into effect on February 14. There is concern about the impact of shutdowns imposed by the coronavirus. Chinese authorities acknowledged the likely economic impact of the COVID-19 outbreak, and they said enough measures were taken to cushion any fallout.
So how has the COVID-19 outbreak changed the relationship between China and the United States and having its repercussions on the global economy and the trade relations between the two countries? The relation is getting better or worse in sickness and in health? To understand better, let's invite through Skype Gregg Gilligan. He's now in Beijing. He's the chairman of AmCham China. Gregg, what a pleasure to see you right here on the program.
Always a pleasure to speak with you, Wei.
Thank you, Gregg. Tell me, first of all, of the solidarity and also the sympathies being expressed by the American business community in China, members of AmCham, this time as supporting the Chinese people throughout the outbreak of COVID-19. What is the latest?
Right now, American Chamber of Commerce China members have donated goods and funds to the tune of about $66 million US. We expect that that number probably will continue to grow, but that's what it was as of February 17. And that is simply us, caring for the society in which we live and work. We call ourselves the American Chamber of Commerce, but in fact, we're a collection of Americans and Chinese people working together in American enterprise, serving these communities here. So we did this survey and checked with our membership because of the response rate of the survey. Actually, the number of $66 million only represents about less than 10% of the member companies that responded. So the number could be quite larger.
But maybe
as I expected, it could also grow and doesn't include donation of services like logistics and transportation and insurance. So really, we're very proud of what American companies are doing here to help.
But many wonder, Gregg, whether it is only an action of PR, public relations, because as you may know, some people here in China might ask that question as a result of a long time lack of trust deficit between the two countries. So are these just PR actions coming from American business community?
The answer is a resounding no. They are not simply PR actions. What they are is us caring about, the communities we live in and we work in. Care about our people here and all of our wonderful friends and partners. It's a great question, though, and it deserves a little more exploration. Like anything in the U.S.-China relationship, it involves some cultural differences. And it causes me to think back to 2008 after the Wenchuan earthquake, when American business actually learned a lot from Chinese enterprise. Culturally speaking, American businesses would tend, in a situation like this, to want to be low-key and downplay any communication around these type of things like humanitarian aid. But what we learned at that time was that we had to put on our socialist thinking caps. We needed to be like our Chinese enterprise friends. We were caring for the communities, but also letting them know what we were doing, which in China society is viewed as appropriate and really a marker of commitment and compassion.
I see. Let me ask you about this. There's a survey that's been done by members of AmCham from one of the well-developed areas in China. I wouldn't mention the places specifically, but the number had been showing that 78% of the respondents said they do not have sufficient staff right now at their Chinese plants to resume full production. And also, they're suggesting public health restrictions make it harder for workers to return to their jobs. Now, that's the number. But on the other hand, Gregg, as you may know, in a public health outbreak like this, containment and control, quarantine and treatment, extremely important, particularly in different localities. So how should we see this balance of, once again, making sure people are healthy, on the other hand, also resumption of work, resumption of production?
First of all, everybody agrees that the absolute imperative is to slow down, control, and eventually eradicate the spread of COVID-19. That's without question. Let's also recognize just how incredibly difficult it is for the local officials to strike the balance that's necessary going forward. I can't imagine the burdens and challenges they face. However, people need several things. First of all, they need to stay safe and healthy, but they also need an income to take care of themselves and their families. And society needs a functioning economy. So we get back to this question of how do we strike that balance. Absolutely, controlling the virus comes first, but a very close second is how do we get people back to work? How do we support the resumption of productivity such that society can function? And so there's a lot of measures that are in place, but they came into place very quickly, and maybe they weren't fully thought out about what the ramifications of certain measures would be. So we need tweaking, we need more support and coordination from the central authority down to the various geographies such that that balance is handled well.
Right.
So yeah, we're having challenges on getting people back to work in place, and trying to work with government to strike that balance in the best possible way.
Talking about central government, Gregg, as you may have noticed together with members of AmCham China, that the central government of China has been putting out one measure after another over the past 2 weeks in order to gear up the economy and putting confidence into investors' minds. Whether these policies are likely to be beautifully implemented through what time frame, and which policies do you think might benefit American businesses the most, given the current circumstances, Gregg?
In our view, and reflected by our members, what's absolutely essential at this moment in time is resumption of work measures and measures that allow the greatest amount of productivity we can while keeping people safe. Other measures about longer-term support for business, those are great, they're necessary, they're welcome. But what's really the first thing to do is to make sure that people are back at work in a safe environment and we can ramp up productivity. Right now, that's necessary for society, as we mentioned a moment ago. It's also necessary so that people can generate revenue, because in situations like this, revenue and then cash flow is king.
Yeah.
You need to be able to survive to enjoy later policy that can help you out through a tough time. But if you're not around when those policies do come into place, then that's a challenge. So smaller enterprise, medium-sized enterprise are going to have less wherewithal, less ability to endure revenue and cash flow challenges.
On the other hand, this in a way demonstrates, some argue, Gregg, the interlink between the Chinese economy and the American economy, between the Chinese business community and the American business community. Within a few weeks' time, we have already seen that people are crying for reconnected again, and also crying for the opportunity to work together. So this, in a way, is rather ironic, because earlier during the protracted trade war between the two countries, those things have not been heard out loud, and it is only taking a crisis like this, unfortunately, that these voices are coming out and pointing us to the right direction, it seems.
Solidarity is crucial in times like these. We have a lot of shared interests. Yes, we have some other things that cause tension in the relationship, but we can't conflate the two. We can't bring those together. Right now, our common interest is to combat COVID-19, get the economy back on track, and continue to do well together. There's so many areas of global mutual interest that China and the U.S. share. This is certainly one of them. We need to keep that in mind.
On the other hand, Gregg, if I could continue our conversation, one is not only about the American and Chinese business communities doing business in China, but also in other parts of the world. I understand your sister or brother, AmCham, in Vietnam have also been doing service among their members, and it seems that without the global supply chain member like China in operation, many of the American businesses in other parts of Asia and elsewhere in the world are also having a difficult time starting their operations and manufacturing, at least for the longer term.
Certainly, because our two economies are so interconnected, and the most striking example, of course, is global supply chain. So when there's a hiccup in global supply chain or a serious disruption, as we have right now, global enterprise everywhere is going to feel it. And so again, that comes back to our mutual interest, or our common interest, in getting through this crisis and then being able to move forward after COVID-19 is controlled and put away.
But there seems to be something going on between the governments, it seems, not between the business communities, fortunately, but between the governments. If I could, Gregg, people have been talking about the U.S. State Department issuing the highest alert travel ban against China, and also has been asking people who have been to China's Hubei to be quarantined at least 2 weeks once arriving in the United States, and also ban any traveling of any foreigners who have been to China over the past 2 weeks, for example. So people see this as rather measures further blocking the interactions between China and the United States. What do you think, and what does that mean for business communities like yours, which making the international travel a must in your daily work?
I think that these actions from quite a few countries are simply trying to protect their borders and people at home, and in the same way that China is trying to fight the virus here. So I'll leave it at that and then speak more closely to impact to AmCham China member companies, executives. The virus really became well known and understood and more of a concern during the Chinese New Year. And at that time, many of our executives, whether they're American or Chinese executives, they were offshore on holiday, and many of them remain offshore right now. In the last week or so, a good number of them have begun to return and get back to work. So what they'll do then is to self-quarantine for 14 days so that they can ensure that they bring themselves back to work in a safe manner. Now, if we're talking about workers in knowledge work or white-collar services, etc., that's much more manageable. But if you're talking about production or other services like logistics and transportation, healthcare, the tourism or hospitality industry, etc., there's a long list of industries that are really going to struggle, because it's not the executives coming back from holiday offshore, it's the larger workforce. So how do you get the PRC national workforce back to work, assure their safety, and then also allow productivity to ramp up?
Right.
So that's where our challenge is.
I guess there's a lot to explore with weeks ahead. How should we figure out the solution in a crisis like this? Always a big question mark, but also always a big opportunity to work together. Thank you so much, Gregg Gilligan, Chairman of AmCham China. Really appreciate it, Greg. All the best to you and your members. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, Wei.
And further our discussion, I'm joined in Bangkok by Jeffrey Townsend, who is a professor at Peking University and host of Jeff's Asia Tech class. And also joining us in Hong Kong, we have Hong Hao, Managing Director and Head of Research at Bocom International. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. You heard my earlier conversation with Gregg Gilligan, the Chairman of AmCham China. Obviously, there are several sectors in our conversation that we worth to be discussed again. One is car manufacturing. The other, of course, is catering industry, including travel services, hotels, and also restaurants, things like that. How are we going to see these sectors likely to be affected by the current crisis? Mr. Hong.
Yeah, well, I think the box office intake during the holiday season is down 99.9%. So I think that's pretty much decimated. And also car sales is down, to the level of 10% of normal sales during this time of the year. So I think all the service industries are very hard hit. I think people are hoping for some sort of a consumption stimulus to help these industries to recover after the virus spread. But I think, going forward, in the next 3 quarters, I think, the hope for recovery in the service sector is running very high.
And Mr. Townsend, of course, car manufacturing, a big chunk of trade. If you look at Wuhan, that is a big town for car manufacturers. Big donation, or rather contribution, to the national economy when it comes to the percentage also. So, Mr. Townsend, how do you see that, and how long are we likely to see the industry still trying to struggle up?
Right. I would look at this sort of on the demand side and on the production side.
Sure.
If you look at, say, cars being sold in the U.S., well, American consumers are still buying cars. Chinese consumers aren't buying a lot of cars this month. You know, most people are waiting and seeing what's going to happen. So it depends if you're going to get the demand hit as well as the issue of, look, we've got to get people back into the factories and back to working. I suspect the car industry generally has a demand problem in China this month. You're probably going to wait a month or so to buy.
Right.
But that bigger question of how do we get people back into the factories, how do we get people out of their apartments, I think that was mentioned earlier in the discussion, that it's going to be balancing this need to get the economy back moving, but not taking undue risks and, you know, protecting safety as well as production. It's going to be balancing those two factors, I think.
It's always a delicate balance, I think, as the time goes by over the next few weeks, as we see the latest information coming out. Having said that, though, there are certain sectors that are very active, in fact, over the past few weeks since the outbreak. We see online education, we see pharmaceutical companies, we also see, you know, some kinds of online entertainment, even online disco. We have seen recently a fad like that in the Chinese home economy, as they say these days, quote unquote. So, Mr. Hong, how do you see the prospect of these areas? Will this be a starting point, a jumping point for these industries if we talk about the economy?
Yeah, I think while you gain some and you lose some, you know, because kids are not, you know, back to school for safety reason, for healthcare reason. So I think many of the classes actually being conducted online. I mean, also many forms of entertainment, for example, movie viewing is moved onto the internet as well. So I think, you know, these industries are having a sort of unusual boom this time of the year. Now, if you compare to 2003, you know, back then, you know, most of the businesses are conducted on a brick-to-mortar basis. You know, now the situation has changed substantially, and I think, you know, these industries that you mentioned just now would benefit to a certain extent from this virus.
Mr. Townsend, you've been researching about the Chinese businesses landscape for a long time. So remember, it was during and after SARS. Alibaba has eventually decided on its direction of development. I'm not trying to say there is a big silver lining out of this crisis. I'm just saying this is a reality and businesses have to deal with. What do you think might be some of the ideas that could come out this time? Of course, the size of the Chinese economy now is very different from earlier times.
Right. I mean, we're definitely going to see a surge in just volume of things like people watching videos. Fine. But we're also seeing a surge in innovation. I mean, there's a lot of new ideas happening right now. During the SARS crisis, there was a small retailer in Beijing that only had physical stores. And because of the SARS crisis, their people couldn't come into the office. So they said, let's try selling online for the first time. Yeah. That's Jingdong. That's how they got into online commerce. So we're seeing a surge of this sort of online education technology, business-to-business interactions, WeChat Work, DingTalk. I mean, there's a whole lot going on right now. And I think that's going to pay off 5 years from now. We're going to look back at this as a pivotal moment for certain businesses.
But, you know, there is always an issue going on there, and Mr. Hong, if I could. That is, what about the kinds of companies that are active here? Now we see the small and medium-sized companies are really suffering as a result of long delays of going back to work. But on the other hand, you see these internet giants are getting ever stronger during this period of time because their services they're providing and the ability to switch as a result of their strong backing are really functioning. But then you also look at the foreign companies as a result of the lack of workers and things like that. It could be difficult for them to restart as they were before the holiday. So there seems to be also some landscape changing, Mr. Hong. I don't know whether it's short term or going to be much longer term.
Well, I think the trend to move things online has been happening even before the virus spread. I think, you know, you've seen Alibaba, Tencent, and Meituan amongst the others, you know, these platform companies actually taking market share from traditional retail. So it's not surprising that now, you know, the virus spread seems to be accelerating this trend. And also, in terms of smaller business, they're having some working capital, cash flow problems, and they're getting help from the central bank to a certain extent. And also, I think, cooperation, from the workers, not to be paid, for some of the days in February also helped the cash flow as well. So I think the trend is quite clear even before the virus spread.
Mr. Townsend? The different kinds of companies, Chinese, internet giants, foreign companies, small and medium-sized companies, different categories.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it at the corporate level, it's about cash flow. Everyone just needs the cash flow to survive. But more important to that is salaries. At a certain point, small businesses go to pay their salaries of their employees on the first of the month, and there's just no money there because people aren't buying tickets to Disneyland this month. And that's actually, I think, the harder problem to solve. You can close a business and restart it in a month. You can close a factory. If you can't pay people, that's a big social problem. So I think that's probably the number one priority is keep people getting their salaries and then keep the businesses alive as well.
On the other hand, there could be some anticipate once the outbreak slows down and things going much more back to normal, an eruption of consumption power out of the Chinese. If you look around among your friends, there are people talking online about what food they really want to have, which restaurant they really want to go, which place they really want to travel once they could be free out of the disease. So how do we see the potential of this so-called eruption of consumption power, Mr. Hong?
I am less optimistic about that. Simply you can't eat, all the missing meals that you missed out in February and March, and then, try to make it up in the next 3 quarters. But having said that, you should see a rebound in consumption after the virus being controlled. And I think for now, from the official numbers, the infection of the virus spread seems to be behind us. So I would say that, with very strong quarantine efforts, and also, with medical help from all around the world, I would say that, the outlook is looking more promising now.
Mr. Townsend, of course, many people have been warning us, it's too early to say what is likely to be the turning point, but we always have the best wishes, of course, for the economy and also certainly for the health of the people. Having said that, though, there are a lot of uncertainties. For example, whether the virus is likely to spread further into other parts of the world. Knocking the wood, I hope it would not, but we do not know in a public health crisis like this. So, Mr. Townsend, how much uncertainties do we still have to bear in mind while we are thinking about a way out, Mr. Townsend?
Yeah, I think there's 2 factors here. One is how much we don't know.
A lot, right?
The problem with viruses is it's a system-wide phenomenon. It's not like one hospital can study their patients. You have to know what's happening everywhere, which is actually very, very difficult to do. Public health is difficult. But the other factor is there's a learning curve here. And the system and the hospitals and the people are getting smarter and are able to deal with uncertainties now far better than they could have, say, a month ago. So they're getting better at managing the situation as we go. And I think that's kind of going to be one of the biggest factors here is everyone's getting smarter. Businesses, people, government, hospitals. And so we'll probably deal with new uncertainties better now than, say, the beginning of January.
Hope everyone is getting smarter except the virus. Thank you so much for the 2 of you. If I could have both of them once again on the screen, Jeffrey Townsend and Hong Hao. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our live program. Alarm bells over another outbreak of locusts. How big a threat to Africa and even Asia? That's up for discussion right after this break. One after another crisis. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Now let's turn to another crisis, a gathering plague of locusts. East Africa is facing its worst locust swarms in 70 years, with Kenya particularly hard hit. And now it has spread to countries outside Africa. What's the best way to prevent and control the invasion of locusts? Before we get down to a discussion with real experts in the know, take a look at this first.
Invading legions of locusts are affecting dozens of countries in Africa and Asia. Massive swarms have been destroying farmland and threatening millions of lives. Even troops and planes have been mobilized in the Horn of Africa to fight the most serious plague in decades.
For the infested areas, definitely Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, but also Eritrea. Then countries at risk in Eastern Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, and also Uganda. Sudan and Egypt are also infested. So we are looking at a whole region of locusts because of these conditions, which are very suitable for locust breeding.
Efforts to control the locust infestation have so far not been effective. Aerial spraying of pesticides is the most effective way to control the swarms, but countries in the region do not have the resources. The UN body last week called on the international community to provide nearly $76 million to fund the spraying of the affected areas with insecticide. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the worst-case scenario could be the locust population would swell 500-fold by June. Asian countries have been gearing up to battle the locust invasion after it spread to Pakistan this month. Chinese farm experts say it's extremely unlikely that desert locusts will directly migrate to China's inland areas, but if the overseas desert locust plague persists, the probability of locusts entering China this summer will sharply rise.
For more on the locust plague in Rome, we have Keith Cressman, a senior locust expert at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Welcome, sir. In Washington, D.C., we're joined by Wu Changhua, the Chief Executive Officer of the Beijing Innovation Center. Welcome as well. Let me go to you first, Cressman, about the latest locust plague. What exactly is the situation now? I have a number here to share with our audience. A swarm, just 1 kilometer square of locusts, could eat as much food as 35,000 people in a day. That is a huge amount. Mr. Cressman, what is the latest situation?
Well, the latest situation at the moment, it's most serious in the Horn of Africa, as you've mentioned, in 3 main countries, in Ethiopia, Somalia, and in Kenya. Now, in all 3 countries, swarms have been forming, developing, and maturing, and now those swarms are laying eggs in the countries. So far, in Kenya, they've started to hatch into the wingless nymphs, what we call hopper bands, and you can imagine them as kind of moving carpets of locusts across the desert floor. Somalia, much the same, is occurring at the same time, and in Ethiopia, the hatching is just about ready to commence. Now, what's important about the timing of the breeding is that it takes about 6 weeks for those new hatchlings to become adults. So that means roughly about the end of March, they will become new adults and they will form new immature swarms. Now, at that point in time, it's the beginning of the seasonal rains, what we call the long rains in Eastern Africa, in those 3 countries. And so this is a time when the farmers generally plant their crops. And so this means there will be a significant risk at the time of planting of the next season. This is very, very critical. But in addition to those 3 countries, of course, other countries have been invaded. Most recently, Tanzania received a few swarms north of Mount Kilimanjaro. Eastern Uganda received some swarms that moved north into the country and crossed the border the past few days into South Sudan. Now, these 3 countries, they have not seen swarms since 1961. So this is a very, very rare phenomenon. Now, in addition to this, of course, the story is very complex with desert locusts. This is the hottest area at the moment, but there's 2 other hot spots that we're watching. One is along both sides of the Red Sea in Sudan, Eritrea, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, where new swarms are forming. And this third hotspot is the southern coast of Iran in Southwest Asia.
Right. If I could continue to ask a bit, Mr. Cressman, what about in this part of Asia? People suggest there could also be the danger due to the earlier factors mentioned in our background. Or what would you say, Mr. Cressman?
Well, first, just to clarify a few things about Asia. India and Pakistan, of course, they were invaded last summer at the beginning of the monsoon breeding period in about May, and that invasion occurred from Iran as swarms were produced there the previous spring. And then both countries, India and Pakistan, faced a very severe locust infestations throughout the summer until just last month. There's still a few remaining swarms in both countries along both sides of the border in the desert. Now, these are not a threat at the moment. The threat lies later this year, at the beginning again of the summer, so around May or June, when once again both countries, India and Pakistan, will be threatened from those spring-bred swarms in southern Iran. But this year it'll be a little bit different because in addition to that threat, they will also be threatened by any swarms that continue to produce in the Horn of Africa, where in about May or June, they will be carried by the southwest monsoon winds that cross the Indian Ocean, and they can easily move from northeastern Somalia to the border areas of India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
Now, historically, locusts in the late 40s and in the early 1950s, they moved across India towards Bangladesh. But they did not move further than Bangladesh because of the winds and also because it's too humid, there's no desert areas, it's outside of really the desert locust range. So there's not a threat to China this summer or at any time because the locusts simply cannot reach China.
I see. Ms. Wu, in the past decades of history, China had the time to fight against the locust invasion. And I still remember some of those old movies depicting scenes like that. Ms. Wu, how do you think the Chinese are looking at the locust invasion and thinking about, the root causes if we have seen over the past 2 decades of natural disasters and public health crisis one after another? Ms. Wu.
Sure. I think for Asia, particularly for China, so locust has been a very ancient sort of a past, impacting the food security livelihoods over the decades, even centuries there. So over the decades or centuries, China definitely has accumulated a lot of experience in trying to make sure to grapple the situation or more in a preventive manner. So in this current sort of plague situation, as Keith mentioned, probably or less probability that they're going to come over to China. But China itself, we do have large desert areas. And now with the climate change happening and with extreme weather events, so there's a huge risk or uncertainty that's still existing in China today, whether locusts will come back to China and be, forming a plague that impacting the livelihoods and the food security. But today, of course, compared to before, China is in a much stronger position in terms of expertise, capability, and the public policy. So I'm hoping somehow, with all the things happening around the Chinese government and Chinese society, will be really sort of, get together and more in a, emergency response sort of mood, make sure we prevent it and prevent it happening in China.
2 things, Mr. Cressman. One is, of course, to understand the root cause of locust plague like this. There are a lot of discussions about this, no definite answer yet. But on the other hand is how should we address the issue right now? What can be done on those 2 fronts? Would you like to share some insights briefly?
Sure, of course. This current situation developed about 18 months ago in 2018 as a result of 2 cyclones from the Indian Ocean that brought heavy rains to the Arabian Peninsula. Historically, locust plagues have developed from cyclones in the past from the Indian Ocean. So this is extremely important events, and we're seeing now an increase in the frequency of cyclones in the Indian Ocean. So if this trend continues, of course, I think we can expect more outbreaks and upsurges of the desert locust in the Horn of Africa. Now, of course, this is the desert locust species. This is a different species than what the speaker was talking about in China. There it's the Asian migratory locust, and of course, they have their own challenges and outbreaks there. But they're not related. It's like apples and oranges, in fact. There's no relationship. Now, in terms of the current outbreak and upsurge, what can be done? Of course, it's increasing and upscaling those aerial control operations that were mentioned earlier. And this is paramount. When there's such a magnitude of a problem that we're facing now, it's only aerial applications that can bring the situation under control with, of course, the help of the weather. So if the weather continues to favor the desert locust, and if these aerial applications and if FAO's appeal is not quickly responded to, of course, that would be the worst case scenario. And then in that situation, we could be facing a much larger plague by the end of 2020.
Right. Ms. Wu, before we go, I also have this last question for you as well. Now, natural disasters has no national boundaries. And when it comes to hunger as a result of natural disaster, it also has an impact all over the world when it comes to social and political, economic. So what do you say at this point as a scientist and as an advocate about the climate change when looking at things like this?
It's unfortunate that climate change is already the new norm of the day, right? We have to live through it, and we have to bear the consequences like the plague of the locusts, like the novel coronavirus, and many others like extreme natural disasters there. Very important today, the global community has to come together. As we know very, very clearly, what's happening in East Africa today, there is a huge repercussion for global risk, right? Just imagine if people's livelihoods and food security, famine happens, and we're going to see more unrest, we're going to see more ecological refugees, and the global uncertainty, stability definitely is under threat. Yeah. So in that context, definitely for global challenges like this requires global solutions. Unfortunately, actually, today, if you look at the globalism and multilateralism, they are under tremendous threat and challenging the legitimacy. But fortunately, we still have the multilateral institutional infrastructure together, that UN and others together. So we still have the sort of infrastructure together so that we'll be able to pull solutions together quickly.
Thank you so much, Wu Changhua and Keith Cressman. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Really appreciate it. That's all the time we have for today. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching, and bye for now.